point out that I'm really giving a sketch today of some of the intricacies of the engagement between the ancient world and the formation of modern scientific racism and its popularization. So please feel free to come at me with any, if I mention something that, you know, sort of flies by, feel free to bring it back up in the question time. There's just so much material because the 19th century, early 20th century anthropologists were so racist that it's like the gift that keeps on giving. And so every time I open up a new document, I'm like, well, this is going to be another chapter in a book I'm still not even writing. So I will try to sort of make sure that this is as accessible as possible. So today I want to basically address some of the ways that the ancient Greco-Roman past has been used to construct white racial identity, specifically as it's manifested in the United States, Canada, sort of Australia, some of the European colonized spaces, and Europe over the last 200 years. I want to focus particularly on the crafting of scientifically justified bioracial hierarchies between European colonizers, enslaved Africans, and indigenous American peoples. I'll then turn to the public marketing of these sciences to broader audiences through a specific appeal to the classical. So before I start, though, I'm going to give you guys a series of definitions so that you know what I mean when I use certain terms, because some of these terms are actually not generally understood the same way. So first, I want to start off with differentiating three terms that often get put all together into one term, sometimes as race, sometimes as ethnicity. Race, biorace, and ethnicity. And just for information, I used to craft these frameworks. I'm engaging primarily with philosophies of race, critical race theory, and the work of Maurizio Bettini for ethnicity and the history of anthropology. So when I say the word race, what I actually mean is the technology for managing human populations that institutionalizes ethnic prejudice, oppression, and inequality based on imaginary and changeable signifiers for human difference. These signifiers can actually be different in different times and spaces. And this is why we can have issues of race in India, in China, in the medieval world, in the pre-modern world, more generally speaking. We don't all do race the same, but race exists. Biorace is one form of race, a fiction that certain visible physical characteristics or blood or biological descent among peoples are signs of moral and intellectual abilities, and that people can be classified along the lines of these biological differences for explaining social, political, and economic inequalities. So biorace is actually the signifier in our modern scientific discourse or scientized discourse for how we mean race. But if you think of it this way, in the United States, we have a US Census where people have to check a box. That box that you check is not actually race. It's the census itself that requires you to put yourself into that box, right? So there's the signifier and then the system itself. And then ethnicity, I use to distinguish sort of in a Weberian sense, where we think of this as a sort of either a self or other grouping based primarily on cultural practices, but can also incorporate the concept of kinship, but kinship usually sort of very writ large and not in a very narrow definition, as well as potentially geography. Next, racism itself is an ideology. It's the practice of a double standard that naturalizes the idea that human differences signify superiority or inferiority. These double standards enable the reinforcement of prejudice and justify oppression. And this definition I actually take from Fields and Fields' Racecraft. So Karen and Barbara Fields. And then white supremacism. I always want to make sure I define this one because some people think that white supremacists is just like Nazis with flags, you know, jumping around, or Confederate flags and things, and that's not it. That's one version of it. But it's a specific racial ideology that either assumes a group called white is superior to others, or that it is a norm or neutral position from which others degenerate or deviate. And we'll see this both in our 19th century materials, but you'll also hear it today. You can actually have white supremacism without overt racism. So I think that's something that I always like to point out before I get started. All right, so I want to start from a theory that is currently popular with many far-right groups, and that has been re-entering the mainstream of conservative thought, Great Replacement theory. So Great Replacement theory has its roots most directly in the 1916 book by this dude. Let me see if I push the right button. Madison Grant. He wrote a book called Passing of the Great Race, which inspired the work then of this other dude, Lothrop Stoddard here, who is most famous for getting completely kicked down by Du Bois at a debate on race. But he is also known for his 1920 book, The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, both of which works and individuals, so both of these guys, who were very influential both on US immigration policy and on Hitler. He actually loved Madison Grant, and Lothrop Stoddard actually wrote puff pieces for Time about the Germany that Hitler was creating before World War II began. So they're all sort of buddy-buddy. The theory of Great Replacement became an inspiration for a 1978 French dystopian fiction novel about mass immigration of North Africans into France that literally in the book overnight replaces the entire population. And this book itself has become very popular in certain extremist corners on the internet and elsewhere. The theory is currently being promoted, in fact, quite widely in far-right media in the US, Europe, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand to drive political opinion on immigration policy, and it has in fact inspired numerous mass killings. This poster appeared on my own university campus back in 2019, or back in 2020, during the summer of 2019 it appeared, is when it was there. It depicts Breton Harrison Tarrant, the terrorist who killed over 50 people in a mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2019. He left behind a manifesto which expressed his belief in Great Replacement theory. The poster itself was made by a local Ohio group called Stormfront, one of the oldest continuous neo-Nazi organizations in the United States. The idea is that mass immigration from the global south of Asians, Jews, and even Eastern Europeans will lead to the replacement of white people of Northern European descent, or what have been called at times, and we'll see in our sources, Aryans and Anglo-Saxons, and the disappearance then of the dominant once white race. And he's actually holding, in his hands here, a copy of the book, the novel, The Great Replacement Theory. And then, of course, you see the Star of David covering his mouth. So the idea is that if we censor students and say they can't use hate speech or something on campus, that we are the real violence and we're sort of bringing in threats of violence against ourselves. So yeah, it was fun having this on campus. Now, these ideas shaped anti-immigration policies concerning indigenous peoples, Jim Crow segregation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the US eugenics movement. They were popularized through things like World's Fairs and State Fairs, museum displays, especially in natural history museums, which Madison Grant was really involved in. The introduction of physical education classes in US school systems, even the invention of breakfast cereals were part of this. Kellogg's Corn Flakes was actually invented as part of the American eugenics movement. So good times every time you eat your cornflakes, right? Particularly important was the widespread use of specific aspects of the classical, especially architectural features, sculpture, general imagery, and references to a short list of ancient Greek and Roman texts and events. Now, the classical, as I will discuss in a bit, has been the public face in many ways of the form of racism that we call white supremacism. But it was also an early foundation for the ideas of both race and biorace. Great Replacement theory was built from earlier theories of conquest and replacement concerning antiquity, like the so-called Aryan or Dorian invasion. And the idea that Greeks and Romans expressed about physical difference and cultural difference became the infrastructure for the development of population management schemes rooted in biorace. It's a rather complicated web, so I'm hoping to untangle a bit of it for us here today, while also showing the interconnectedness of these various branches of scientific racism. So there's going to be three ideas that I'm going to trace out from antiquity into the modern forms of white supremacism and scientific racism. And they are what we refer to as environmental determinism often, or climatic determinism, evolution or theories of progress of societies or civilization, and then population management schemes. So they often operate together, with one aspect or the other being more prominent in a particular scientist or a particular movement. And in the ancient texts, they're also intertwined. You can't really pull them apart, but sometimes they'll just be elevated in various contexts. So I'll start with environmental determinism theory. And our father of this theory, Hippocrates. So this text that I'm going to mention, the Airs, Waters, Places, we don't know if it was written by Hippocrates. We just refer to it as the Hippocratic author oftentimes, because most of the texts we have that come under the corpus were not written by Hippocrates, but this one is one that possibly was, because it's early enough. The rest of them are way too late for them to ever have been by Hippocrates. This one might have been. This particular book, as well as the other two books that I'll talk about, Lucretius's De Rerum Natura and Plato's Republic, were on, starting in the 1870s or so, college curricula, set curricula. This was the only Hippocratic text from the entirety of the Hippocratic corpus that is actually read by all American college students in these sort of schools, in Columbia, the Ivy Leagues and other schools. So these are the principles of environmental determinism. Environment as determining factor in the creation of cultural and moral characteristics of people. So the idea is that the world is divided into 3 zones. There's the cold zone, the temperate zone, and the hot zone. And the further parts of the north and the south are uninhabitable because they're either too cold or they're too hot. And it's based on humoral theory. So the humoral theory is that everybody's body is a balance of hot, dry, wet, and cold. And so the idea is that the world is also a balance of hot, dry, wet, and cold. So if you live in a place that is cold and wet, so it's cold and it snows, welcome here, right? Then you're going to have certain specific cultural responses to that, or you're going to have specific physiological responses to that. If you live in the far south, you're going to have specific ones because it's hot and dry. So lots of sunshine, lots of dryness. But people who live in the middle, which happen to be Greeks and Italians and Persians and stuff in our ancient scheme, they will have the perfect balance. So it basically takes the idea of bodily health and transports it onto the globe. All right. So the second characteristic is heritability of acquired characteristics from external influences. This one, I'll give you the sort of primary example because we're going to come back to it. It gets referenced again and again in our 19th and early 20th sources. There's a group of people known as the macrocephali, meaning long heads or big heads. And Hippocrates, or the author of this, tells us that because of they thought it was more beautiful, because of their aesthetic desires, they thought cone heads were more attractive. So they began shaping the babies' heads into cones, and then they tell us about the process of wrapping and bandaging it to shape the heads. But then he says, where design was originally in place, nature took over and reproduced it itself. And then it was only when they started intermarrying with other groups that the cone heads started to diminish. Though he doesn't say whether or not they diminished because they stopped bandaging them, or if it's because of miscegenation with people with, quote unquote, normal heads, not long heads. And then finally, the use of technology to alter or overcome environmentally determined or hereditary deficiencies. And here I'll give you again the prime case. It's a group of Scythians who live in the far north, so the steppe people of the Eurasian steppe. They are the paradigmatic, quote unquote, noble savage or barbarian trope that gets transported into most representations of indigenous peoples in the sort of western part of the North American continent. But in the case of the Hippocratic text, the land they live in is cold and wet. And so the assumption is that the impact of all that cold and wet on the body is that the body will soak it up and be like a sponge. And so have you guys seen the movie WALL-E? This is what he imagines they must have looked like as a result. Sort of, you couldn't see their bones, they say, and sort of like, he calls them marvels of flab, right? But their actual experience of Scythians, the Scythians that they know, which are primarily mercenaries, they are very taut, muscular, horseback riding warriors. So their visual recognition of what a Scythian actually looks like versus the scheme that they must look like in the medical world, he has to come up with a way to bridge that gap. And so he argues that what they actually did was they cauterized the moisture out of their bodies, right? So it's the application of a technology to overcome an environmental problem, all right? And then our friend Vitruvius, who we'll spend a lot of time with, he adds another layer on, which is that it's not just that you can apply these technologies to the body to overcome the technology, but you can actually reshape your physical environment itself to make sure that it adapts to your needs as a person, as a human. So the Romans, of course, they love draining swamps. Why do you drain swamps? Because they actually understood, the Hippocratic author here understood in the 5th century that malaria was somehow connected to swamps and too much water. Didn't understand that it was mosquitoes, but understood a connection. And so Romans took this to heart, and they loved draining land of swamps and repurposing it, of making it useful for themselves. And that actually becomes, for the Romans in the Vitruvius text, a hallmark of Romanness. of Roman identity is the ability to apply technology to a landscape and engineer it. Right? So specifically here with our Hippocratic author, people who are in hot climates, just to give you the sort of very schematic nature of this, people from hot climates were characterized as lazy, having darker skin tones, and cowardice, but extreme intelligence, because the dryness takes all the moisture and phlegm out of your head, and so you're clear-headed. And you are a coward because you're too smart to throw yourself into a battle that you can't win. This is actually what he says in the text. Right? Whereas people from northern climates, cold northern climates, are pale, or they have white skin. They're cold burned. So the southern people are heat burned, and the people from the north are cold burned. But they are considered courageous because they have an excess of phlegm covering their heads, and so they're actually stupid. And they always throw themselves into battle because they also have an excess of blood, and they are extremely independent. They're ungovernable in some contexts. So these are the sort of extreme versions. And then our Greeks and Romans were imagined either by the Greeks imagined themselves to be in the central balanced place, or the Romans imagined themselves to be in the central balanced place. In its modern importation, Northern Europe basically becomes the place of perfect balance. All right. Now, in modern Euro-Anglo-American contexts, the idea of peoples being defined through relationships to environment actually runs very deep. We can actually trace a continuous use of these theories in medical traditions, philosophical traditions, architectural and engineering texts, military manuals, obviously astronomy documents and geography documents. When we get into the medieval world, you see it being used in medical theory because, of course, Hippocrates and Galen are the core of medieval medicine, so that you actually see instances where Christians, Jews, and Muslims are being racialized as separate groups. And these theories are being applied to how you can care for them in the medical tradition. It gets embedded into Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, which then has its own tradition that spans out. And then, of course, it makes its way into the theories of the early evolutionist Lamarck and also Buffon, the naturalist. It continues to function today in things like Jared Diamond's Germs, Guns, Steel discourse, and even Ian Morris's explanations for, quote, why the West rules for now. In the 19th century, also influential, in addition to him, however, is the poet Lucretius. So we're going to go on to Lucretius, who introduces us to the idea of the evolution or progress of civilizations. So he seems to have been very influential on the development of the concept of progress, particularly as it emerges in the 19th century. Inherent to the progress story in race science is hierarchy, a presumption of a superior group over all other groups who are inferior, and that cultural evolution is therefore a matter of survival of the fittest. A phrase that enters the discourse around race after the publication of Darwin's Origin of the Species in 1859 and Descent of Man in 1871, thanks not to Darwin, of course, but to Herbert Spencer, a British philosopher and social scientist who applied Darwin's theories to human societies. Charles Darwin himself, however, was likely influenced in his own theory of evolution by his grandfather, who wrote a poem called either The Temple of Nature or The Origins of Society, published in 1803, that was originally intended to be an imitation of Lucretius' Book 5 of the De Rerum Natura, on the progress of civilization. But just a note, Lucretius, in his evolutionary theory of societies, does not actually see civilization as an absolute good. He actually sees it in part as a degeneration and a fall into luxury, which can corrupt the spirit. So that part gets left out in the modern iterations, but for Lucretius, Julius Caesar, Livy, a lot of these writers at the turn of the end of the late Republic and the emergence of the empire are they question whether or not progress is always positive, particularly when it comes to wealth and luxury and the emergence of these corrupting influences. Now, Spencer's theories are in many ways the origin of our own modern forms of scientific racism as they get embedded into public policy, thinking about sort of welfare schemes and other things. His policies are very influential, but they sit side by side with the environmental theories, which at one point were combined into a model called technogeography, which was developed by the Smithsonian Institute's first curator of anthropology, a guy named Otis Mason. Just make sure we sort of see what is happening here. I want to highlight one point of this before we move on to Mason, which is the idea that the human Earth birthed generations of humans. The first iterations were monstrosities. or deformed, or they could not adapt to or could not adapt to their environment, and so they died off. And it was only once a group of humans actually were born who could survive that we begin the evolution of society. It's actually an important thing to keep. And these are the social developments that he points to. If you've ever read even something like, what's his name's book, Sapiens, he still follows this model. So the Graeber and the Dawn of Everything book is like tried to disrupt this a little bit, but this is still generally the model that people follow. So you can see sort of how far back it goes. All right. Mason is going to be particularly interested in these things and these things. So I just put our great advertisement for progress. This is actually made by a phone company originally, but it's become a pretty famous image of driving out to the darkness and bringing the telegraph and the train to save the world, as we sit next to our friend Mason here. All right, so these are the key ideas of his theory for technogeography. They come from his 1894 presidential address to the Anthropological Society of Washington, which is the actual earlier precursor to the Anthropological Association of America. And this is what he sort of says, right? He takes this idea that human cultures progress from savage to civilized. Not all of them progress at the same rate. So you can have a group of savages who still exist next to the height of civilization in the same time frame. The way that you demonstrate your ability to move along the evolutionary chain for Mason is by your ability to manipulate environment and resources. And so he was particularly keen to collect what he called the crafts and tools and implements of different peoples and to trace their cultural production. Importantly, to dominate the environment is the hallmark of a civilized society for him. All right, I'll show you a chart in a second so you can see it. But then he actually says multiple times, very casually, he just sort of drops in that those peoples who fail to progress should just be eradicated. If they don't die out on their own. The assumption is they'll die out on their own, they should die out on their own, but if they get in the way of other people's progress, just get rid of them. I don't expect any of you to be able to read this, do not fear. But I will point to some things just to sort of make it clear what's happening. So he's taken Henry Louis Morgan's 7 grades of civilization. So you start with the lower savage, middle savage, upper savage, lower barbarian, middle barbarian, upper barbarian, and then the civilized. All right. And then what you have here, he then gives you characteristics. Then he tells you which group will fall into it. And then he sort of lists the different things that you will often see described as civilizational or cultural hallmarks. So clothing, weaponry, forms of transportation, their aesthetic production. And just to grab a couple examples, here under middle savage, we have the Australian Aborigines with what they sort of can do. They use trails and landmarks as opposed to the nomadic Indians who use snow horses, sledges. So they use tools to actually move themselves around, so they get to move up to the upper savage range, as it were. Then you have, the upper barbarous are the Semitic races. And then you have finally under civilized, you have printing as a hallmark. They're the later Aryans, is the way he's categorizing them. But they actually have artistic production, architecture, sculpture, music, etc. In this group, the later Aryan group, he also includes the ancient Greeks and Romans and the Japanese. The Japanese are often referred to in some of these texts as the Greeks of the Far East because of their architectural skill and among other things. But there's also a whole discourse in one book on how the Japanese Aboriginals are probably quote unquote Caucasians originally. So they don't know what to do with the Japanese because the Japanese are so technologically advanced in the 1890s that it freaks them out. And so they can't just put them in. They actually have them separated from China, from Chinese people in the US Census for a while because they couldn't possibly be the same. So they make these schemes up and then they just move people around based on where they want them. And just in case anyone is thinking I'm joking about the casual references to genocide that sort of populate these discourses, this is from his 1894 annual report to Congress. US Congress for the Smithsonian Institute. The right progress looks forward to a time when the whole earth will have been exploited Every pernicious plant and animal and man or tribe been removed, and all that is good domesticated, when the powers of nature will be harnessed or enslaved, when distance and time will offer no impediment to commerce, when it will be easy to put production and consumption in friendly union at the springing up of desire, as it was for primitive man or woman. So this brings up an important point. His ideas are not only supporting a concept of white supremacism, but explicitly white supremacist capitalism. And this is actually one of the places where our World's Fairs are really going to hammer home, because they are displays of technology and industry, first and foremost. Now, Mason was very influenced by Herbert Spencer's work, as were many American scientists, anthropologists, and humanists in higher education in the late 19th century. They were also heavily influenced by what has become, interestingly enough, the most used ancient text in modern universities, Plato's Republic. Perhaps from one of the most well-known passages from Plato's Republic, I'll talk about two different passages, but number one is the Noble Lie, or the so-called Phoenician tale. Socrates and Glaucon discuss how the population of their ideal city will be managed and ordered. It is the so-called noble lie that they will tell to encourage the people to stay in their allotted places. A key element of this section includes an emphasis on the story of each of the groups having been born into specific classes or race, quote unquote, races, as it is often translated, by nature. They are born with gold, silver, bronze, or iron in them. And so they have an inherent quality that places them into a specific status or rank. And then he argues that these groups should be segregated so that only gold and silver can mate with gold and silver, and iron and bronze would mate with iron and bronze, in order to preserve the desired social, or even in our case, bioracial stratification. This story of the sort of metals as being imbued in humans goes all the way back to Hesiod. It has a very long tradition, and it continues on just in different ways. One of the things we can think of, though, is that gold and silver are, of course, pure alloys, and bronze and iron are not. So we have pure and impure have to be in balance. To this passage, the Noble Lie, we can add an earlier conversation in the Republic to marriage practices in their ideal society. And I have given you the quote here: "Given this, it is best to breed the best with the best as often as possible, and the worst breed with the worst as infrequently as possible. It is also necessary that the children of the best be raised, and those of the worst not be. Additionally, if our flock is to be at its peak, everything we have done to make it so needs to remain hidden from everyone except the rulers themselves." So we want them to think that this is natural, that this is the way it is, and only the people pulling the strings on the system are to know that it's actually a structured system and not in nature. Now imagine a classroom where Plato's Republic and these passages and texts are being read alongside Herbert Spencer, the father of social Darwinism, and where students are being asked in these classes to consider these as utopian political structures. This was actually common in the United States for almost 100 years. Between assumptions about human relationships to environments, about how cultures progress, and how one creates and manages social stratifications, these three very popular texts provided all the necessary toolkit they needed for crafting race. Now, Spencer wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of Darwin, his theory of evolution, when he first read it. He was actually a Lamarckian, and I'll point to the important difference there. If Darwin's theory can be summed up as the idea of natural selection over time, Lamarckian evolution actually rests on the borrowed idea of the heredity of acquired characteristics, which he directly took from the Hippocratic airs, waters, places. Thus, Spencer assumed that societies could pass on acquired moral character as well as physical character, and that these were influenced both by environment and social context. Further, Spencer's theory was that societies moved towards more complexity. This also fits in nicely with the idea that technology is the key element in understanding how advanced or progressed a society was. It's easy to see the influence of Spencer on someone like Mason, who in turn influenced Americans broadly through museum displays and by informing federal policy on indigenous peoples through his reports to Congress. All right. Now, a little background on one other aspect of this. There's sort of like three different legs to this stool that we sort of need to address. Now, modern race science's origins are actually traced back before these guys, even though we're going to come back to them. They can be tracked mostly to the botanist Linnaeus and then Johann Friedrich Blumenbach in the late 18th and late 18th and early 19th centuries. They were both part of the long Enlightenment project of classifying life forms, and in particular in the search within their specimens of typicality. So they're trying to find in everything what is the typical. If you can find the typical in the shape of skulls, then you can say this is a type of mankind, and then you can put it into a category, right? Blumenbach adhered to a principle called monogenesis that assumed that all humans were ultimately derived from one group of ancestors. That there was human variation, he believed, was due to degeneracy, i.e. some groups of humans, which he called races, and which I would call bioraces, had degenerated from an origin after moving from one place to another. They moved from the climate suited to them to a climate that was inappropriate for them, and then as a result of their diet. These groups he then ranked from best to worst, because he thought they all originated in a single place, which was in Eurasia. He thought that Adam and Eve were the sort of original people, and that they all sort of came out of Central Asia, where he thought Eden was. And then as they moved out and spread, they went to places where they then degenerated, unless they went to the right places. And this was where the people who became white moved. And he's actually the guy who calls them Caucasians for the first time, because he thought the Caucasus had the most beautiful white people in the world. And so that became his hallmark for the standard for the race. Now, he supported his theory in part with the study of skulls. And this idea of using skulls to classify humans did not end with Blumenbach, nor was it a fringe idea. Others who contributed to this science include a who's who of 19th century physicians, anthropologists, and biologists. Men like, of course, Samuel George Morton, William Matthew Flinders Petrie, for those of you who do Egypt and stuff, and surprisingly, even a young Franz Boas. Boas actually had a booth at the 1893 World's Fair where he would measure your skull for you, and then he would tell you how close you came to the ideal people who were a Harvard and Radcliffe student. They had posters, a Radcliffe student. Yeah, good times. He also, his first report that he ever wrote, study he did for Congress, was on whether or not the American climate made Jewish immigrants bigger and stronger. So this is which he said yes. He said yes. Second generation is always bigger and stronger. But that all goes back to Thomas Jefferson being upset that Buffon said that everything in the Americas was smaller, which is actually why they started hunting for mastodons and mammoths and things. They wanted to find the big animals so they could prove that Americas had big things too, and not just small things like Buffon accused. Jefferson was very upset by this, right? Now, skull measurement or craniometry was a pervasive practice at the turn of the 20th century, and it's actually one of the three key elements used in categorizing people into the new bioraces. Skin color, skulls, and hair texture are the big three, all right? All of these elements of human physiognomy are actually also the ones that are highlighted in ancient texts as either explicitly environmentally determined or as cultural adaptations to environment. The act of skull shaping was considered a particular hallmark of the savage races by our friends at the Smithsonian Institution. Now, in the 1887 report of the Smithsonian's Institute to the US Congress, Mason wrote a detailed discussion of cradles and cradle frames of indigenous groups found in their collection, artifacts ranging from all the way in the far north in the Arctic down to South America. And he was considering whether or not they intentionally were being used to shape babies' malleable bones, or whether it was just incidental to the shape of the cradle. And here are a couple of the illustrations from his report. He goes through sort of all of these different groups one by one and talks about whether or not their skulls are shaped, whether the shaping is intentional or whether it's incidental. Now, his colleague, the physician J.M. Porter, wrote an accompanying piece that followed right after this in the report, where he argued that because of these cultural practices, craniometry actually could not be used to measure the intelligences of people as scholars like Morton did. Both he and Mason remarked that there was no seeming difference in intellectual capacity between the peoples who flattened their heads and those who did not. And just on a side note, as you can imagine, the footnotes to these things are pretty wild. So if you ever want to sort of like really dig into crazy talk of the 19th century on head flattening practices and see all the sources, how many people are doing these studies. There are paragraphs of citations of other studies that people are doing at this time. Now, the sources influencing both Mason and Porter are, once again, our Hippocratic heirs, waters, places, and also our friend Herodotus. We can see this in particular in the names that he gives to various groups of peoples. For example, he actually discusses the macrocephaly as a source for understanding the practices of these different groups in head shaping. As well as the ancient Thracians and Macedonians. Thracians are super well known for tattooing themselves. And so this becomes another sort of standard to think about. Do they tattoo? And then he labels those that are called more normally in this period Eskimos, but which include for us today the Aleut and Inuit peoples. He called them Hyperboreans, which is the name designated in our ancient texts for the people who live in the furthest north. They're almost fantasy people. They're not really considered fully real. They're almost mythical sort of people. Right? So Mason's theories naturalized and gave support for these big three white supremacist policies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries: Jim Crow segregation, the Immigration Restriction Acts, and the Indian Removal Act. Racial segregation and anti-immigration laws are premised on the idea that peoples divided by nature, as they saw it, into these groups should not intermarry or reproduce with each other, and that one can use laws and other structures to ensure that, quote, the best breed with the best, and that the worst breed with the worst as infrequently as possible. Because these peoples were ranked into the hierarchy from savage to civilized, and only those who were alike should be allowed to reproduce. Now, it's only a short leap from this principle to anti-miscegenation laws like Jim Crow and the Nuremberg laws of the Nazis that Jim Crow actually inspired, and the anti-immigration policies of Great Replacement theory, if we want to bring us back to the beginning again. So Madison Grant, in fact, the author of Passing of the Great Race, was a member of the US eugenics movement, the international eugenics movement, and was also integral in helping write and pass major anti-immigration laws. He also worked to pass anti-miscegenation laws, including things like one-drop rule laws. And he was also the founder of New York City's Museum of Natural History. This all comes together, right? Both anti-miscegenation and anti-immigration policies were linked also to the Indian Removal Act and policies of removal of indigenous people in the United States. Removal, in fact, was an enactment of Great Replacement. Underlying this policy were what we refer to as blood and soil or Blut und Boden ideologies. In these theories, the imperialist becomes indigenous by conquest as their blood soaks into the land, making it their own. This is a rather twisted version of indigeneity, but one that of the reasons that Grant and others like him feared a great replacement by influxes of immigrants and the descendants of freed African Americans after the Civil War in the US is because such an invasion and replacement is precisely what the British and French colonizers had done to indigenous populations whose land the US and Canada now cover. This leads us to the final leg of the stool, which is the ancient theory of identity that melded environmental theory and descent-based ideas together, which is autochthony. The Greek term autochthonous is often translated as either native or indigenous, or it has its literal meaning, generated by the earth. Autochthony theory held that the land that one was born from imbued them with characteristics that were derived from the land itself. So, and this is a subset of environmental theory. The idea was that people who were born in forested lands were really tall. There were lots of trees around. People who lived in rocky lands were like really aggressive and coarse and uncultured. Things like this, right? If you lived in a really fine land, the very last paragraph of Herodotus tells us where a story that the Persian king Cyrus does, he tells his troops, if you want to go invade that rocky land, that beautiful lush land over there in Ionia, go for it, but soft lands breed soft people, right? And so the last line of Herodotus. So this is the sort of idea that's embedded in autochthony theories. In the versions of the theory that exist prior to 5th century Athenian manifestations, which are the ones we know best today, the figures born of the earth were almost always monstrous in some way. They're giants, they're gorgons, they're half serpent, half human. We see this definition and image of indigeneity actually used in reference to native groups all over our sources, starting in the 15th century with Jesuit reports back to Spain and other places, all the way up through these 19th and 20th century scientific documents. This is in contrast, however, to the other use of the term. In the 5th century BC, a version emerges in Athens in opposition to the idea of the xenos, the foreigner, who comes to live among you. This figure is called the metoikos. The inhabitant of the land, was kept in a permanent state of removal from the land and from citizenship in the city by law, and political ideology held that this remove was necessary for the city and the citizen to thrive. And Athenian autochthony is actually an imperialist idea that wherever the Athenians conquer, this land is actually theirs, because it turns out there's a myth that connects them to all those lands. The land was given root and stock to Athena back, thousands of years ago. So it is a sort of a foundational story for Blute and Boden ideologies. Now, I'm just going to quickly describe to you a metic and the metic structure, because it is probably the most explicit example of a race system in antiquity. So a metic is basically a category. It's a permanent immigrant, a permanent non-citizen. The category is made up of lots of different people. So free voluntary immigrants and their descendants, formerly enslaved persons and their descendants, refugees and their descendants, illegitimate children of citizens and their descendants. There's no way out of metic status unless you're a wealthy man who can maybe provide ships for the Navy or something, and they'll give you a special grant of citizenship. Every once in a while, we'll have a group of refugees who will get a one-time offer of citizenship. But if you don't take it up at that one time, you can't go back and ask for it later. But there are only 3 such grants that we know of for refugee groups. Importantly, the medics had a series of restrictions on them. It was marked daily that they were not citizens. Even if you were one of the wealthiest medics and you hung out socially with Plato's family and others, the Symposium and a lot of these texts include wealthy medics in them. But these are the same people who Plato's cousins and uncle actually murdered when they took control of the Athenian government. So it's always a temporary relationship. But they had a special tax that they had to pay that nobody else had to pay. They were not allowed to own land or houses. This is to keep making sure that the land was only held by those who were part of the land, as it were. They had to wear red cloaks when they performed rituals at the Panathenaea. Some people say this was a privilege, but it's still a demarcation of difference. So basically, the racecraft that was embedded into their everyday lives was a reminder of their different status. And importantly, there are 3 laws that if you violate as a medic, if you don't register and pay your tax, if you pretend to be a citizen, or if you're claimed to be free but you're really enslaved, you will be sold into enslavement. And so this actually puts the medic on a trajectory. And I'll show you this first and then go back to the other slide. Basically, you have the citizen who cannot be sold into enslavement in the Athenian system. They have inalienable humanity. The slave, of course, is a fully alienated from their humanity, and the medic is alienable. And so this is my colleague, Jackie Murray. This is sort of a spectrum that she sort of put together, dominated to dominant, that we would think of as race, right? This idea of alienable versus inalienable humanity or alienated humanity. When we look at the creation of the medic system, it starts by defining the citizen. You then recognize non-citizens as a threat somehow. You then have to tame them. And the mechanism for taming is always either violence or the threat of violence. You then work to naturalize your categories. You make sure, as Plato tells us, that nobody knows why the categories are this way. It's just assumed that this is how it is, right? And then finally, you reproduce it on a regular basis through racecraft. Now, one of the many values of Mason's reconfiguring of ancient environmental theory to map onto evolutionary theory of cultures from savage to civilized was that it enabled the devaluation of indigeneity of Native Americans because, as the logic goes, they were simply unable to progress by learning to control their environments or adopt to the new ones that they were transported to, while it elevates the idea of becoming indigenous through bloody conquest and environmental engineering via industrial capitalism. So if you map Lucretius's evolutionary model and the indigenous American fails the test of survival, like the mythical deformed or monstrous autochthons and Lucretius's savage humans, because they are not able to adapt the environment, or preferably for Mason, adapt the environment to themselves. You can then put them into these structures as threats to the status quo, right? By the logic of technogeographic environmental theory and evolutionary progress, then, the one who can conquer the land itself through engineering and industry is the true inheritor of that land. Mason's casual insistence that native groups that couldn't adapt should simply have to go was the perfect justification for the US government policies of Indian removal and settler colonialism. All of this was scaffolded from and inspired by his readings in the Greco-Roman classics. I know this for a fact because he was, in fact, a teacher of classics for decades before he became a Smithsonian scientist and turned away from ancient Greece and Rome to indigenous populations and running the Smithsonian Institute. And of course, we can see the curriculum that he taught. And of course, if you read his works, it's just populated with references to all of these things. Now, Grant's anti-immigration policies and Jim Crow in the United States also did not emerge from nowhere either, but had its classical roots in the Athenian autochthony myth. Before the US Civil War and emancipation, Rome was often the model for our legislators and cultural rhetoric, while Athens was, on the one hand, worthy of study for its philosophy and arts, but on the other hand, really bad as a political model because you cannot have those mob Democrats running anything. But when slavery was ended and those formerly enslaved became full citizens on the Roman model of emancipation, this caused a great deal of distress amongst particularly white Southerners. And this distress at the success of Reconstruction, the period after emancipation, it coincided with rapid increases as well in immigration to the US from the Eastern and Southern Europe, and then the US expansion not only westward on the North American continent, but also into the Pacific Islands. The Athenian Metic population management system, with its mechanisms for maintaining a pure citizen body and of ensuring the continued oppression of those deemed other, was the perfect model for maintaining a specifically Anglo-European white supremacist political order. If you want to keep freed slaves and their descendants oppressed, simply craft laws segregating them from access to their rights as citizens. Want to ensure that your indigenous population disappears, and so stop disrupting the settler colonial fantasy of their own indigeneity, enforce ideas like blood quantum and confine them to reservations while taking their children away to schools where they either must assimilate or will never reemerge. At the core of any race system is this violence or the threat of violence in it. Now, these are brutal philosophies of race, resting on the cherry picking from ancient theories of human cultural and physical difference. How did such violent ideas become so popular, though, that they came to dominate 20th century thinking and still linger in our consciousness today and are even being reemerging in the mainstream? And so I want to end my talk by looking at examples of this popularization that happened. And that happened primarily in the United States through World's Fairs. So I'm going to talk about two World's Fairs. I'll give you samples from them. The first is the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the Columbian Exhibition, in honor of Columbusing of the Americas. And the second is the 1904 Louisiana Purchase World's Fair in St. Louis, which was also meant to coincide with the 1904 Olympic Games. But it was meant to showcase American imperialism in the Pacific Islands specifically. Okay, so I just want to show you a couple of images to show you this contrast that gets made in the fairgrounds themselves. All right, so if any of you know anything about Chicago, the World's Fair was built on a former swamp. They engineered the swamp. Vitruvius would have been so proud of them. And in fact, I was mentioning that all architects, even to today, still study Vitruvius. If you look at the scholarship on Vitruvius, it's not classicists, it's all architects writing on it. But they basically built this fair on a former swamp. So this right here is the Grand Basin, sort of the main area of the fair, the Court of Honor. This structure, the center core to the fair, was called the White City, on multi-levels white, because what they did was, this was the place where they showcased the power of industry and technology and the fine arts of white civilization. But they used a gleaming white plaster to imitate what they thought of as the standard for white marble. And then they used classical modeled sculptures all over the fair as ways to represent the allegory. So we have an allegory from the agriculture building for agricultural, but this one is my favorite. That, I think, is the origin point for the concept of the average American. Whenever you hear them in the political discourses, they'll say something like the average American. What they mean, without saying it, is a Midwest farmer type. And that's him right there, right on the Grand Basin, 5 times life size in all his glory. Right now, this was contrasted. The White City was contrasted with the Midway Plaisance, which was the sort of entertainment district, which is where they displayed other cultures. And so here are some representations, photos from that. So we have the Eskimo ride, which was a little roller coaster ride. These are Laplanders. The streets of Cairo, introducing belly dancing to 80 million visitors. But then this one, Javanese, and you can see they're sort of paraded around for the spectacle of the proper Victorian and Edwardian women who would attend. They were essentially, and you'll see this particularly in the St. Louis Fair, this is a page from the 15th century Nuremberg Chronicle, which actually represents the monstrous races at the edges of the world from the text of Pliny the Elder. And this is actually a translation of Pliny the Elder's text about them. But you have the Kunocephaloi, dog heads, the Cyclopes, the Acephalai, they don't have heads, and other people. But importantly, I want to highlight this dude down here who looks like a miniature, like Thumbelina kind of thing, fighting a swan. This is a pygmy. So I'm highlighting him because they're going to come back. And then this is how it's promoted in popular magazines. So here you can see the use of the classical imagery to represent America, and white America in particular, the orderliness of the things. And then this is a representation of an African-American Day at the fair, which was actually supposed to be a day at the fair for African-American communities to highlight the progress they had made since emancipation. And this is how it gets represented in contrast to the others in Puck, which was an early satire magazine in the United States. And just to make sure you understand that environmental determinism was an intimate part of this fair, here's actually a comic representing the sort of emphasis on climate and conquering climate, right? This is where we get this idea that the top of civilization is your ability to exploit resources, right? To exploit the climate, to change the shape and landscape. This is why climate change can't be real, because if climate change is real, then we're the baddies, right? But so here you see the meeting of the two extremes, the far north and the far south, and they get together and they do a climate change. Haha, right? But this is the level of discourse that white Americans were consuming to understand their place and the place of these others in the world at this fair. St. Louis Fair is probably, if anything, more racist than the 1893 Chicago Fair, because they really had perfected it by that time. This is the government building with this sort of Versailles-like gardens and things. Here is another setup of, so you can see the classical emanating through. Here's the Palace of Fine Arts, much more Roman in its styling. But here you see a selection of the different sculptures around. And again, here's actually a postcard you could take home. They have a whole set of these sort of watercolor-like representations of the fair, of picturesque views with a nice, I'll actually show you the front side of this sculpture in just a second. This is the Buffalo Hunter, or the Buffalo Dance, sorry. So this is what white Americans frequented within the Louisiana Purchase. It was called the culmination of civilization. That was the sort of catchword for the fair, right? And here is the representation of indigenous people. This was a very important fair for the American government Indian Affairs Office. This is where they got to put Geronimo and Chief Joseph and some sort of the big names that they had conquered on display, basically. And so you have this beautiful, big industrial neoclassical structures for industry and other things. And then you have a park, basically, where they stage primitive cultures. And then this is one of the sculptures that they have representing, which is the Buffalo Dance. Here is the Igorot group. They're from the Philippines. There were 3 different Philippine groups put on display at this fair. One group were they're called the Negritos, which was the group descended from the former enslaved people on the island, enslaved Africans on the island. These were the indigenous. And then they had people of Spanish ancestry who were mixed Spanish and indigenous. They staged them in a schoolroom. You can even, they can be taught, right? And you could rent one for an hour to walk around the fair together. Yeah, good time. So this is Geronimo and some of his Apache colleagues. They were staged in teepees. And then you have the official portrait of one of the other indigenous groups. This right here, my friend, is W.J. McGee. And he was the successor to Mason at the Smithsonian Institute. And he was in charge of the anthropological production here at the fair. All right. Now, in each fair, The fairgrounds themselves, the print publications about the fairs, toys and other objects that people could take home or buy. The classical is being used and contrasted. The classical being denoting the peak of whiteness and progress in civilization, while a range of inaccurate stereotypes were used to denigrate those deemed other, ranking their cultures on a continuum from savage to only barbarian. They couldn't even get out of the category of barbarian. The same hierarchy, of course, found in Mason's theory of technogeography. In fact, Mason was in charge of the 1893 anthropological government displays, and his successor, McGee, was in charge of the St. Louis Fair. Now, McGee actually writes this publication. This is the official publication of the fair from all the congresses. And this is volume 5, is the ethnology volume. And this is what McGee says of his reasons for putting the fair on. As you can see, the primary motive of the ethnological exhibits is to show the world a little known side of human life, yet it is the aim to do so in such manner that all who come may learn something of the upward course of human development, beginning in the dark ages of tooth and claw and stone and tools and culminating in the modern enlightenment, illustrated in the great exhibit palaces and the international congresses. And so he mapped the fair, in fact, so that you could go visit a primitive society, living society, and walk your way up through the progress of humanity. This is actually an image in the front piece of the book of the volume. This is civilization bringing light to the savage. And then you have ranked by status from lowest to highest. All right. This is a Neanderthal, but then you get the Australian Bushman. So the idea is that this is the sort of ranking of humans. And notice our Japanese folks up here, because they pass the test of some sort. Now, the ideas embedded in these World's Fairs exhibits is part of the history of race science and the struggle to connect a pure Euro-American identity or a pure whiteness to the classical past. And our ancient sources, like Plato's Republic, like Lucretius's narrative of civilization, and the Hippocratic environmental story, embraced selectively and intentionally in the modern world, have provided authoritative voices from the past for people who want to argue the validity, universality, and naturalness of these ideas. This is one of the reasons why it is very incumbent upon those of us who teach and write about the study of the ancient world that we enact critically and conscientiously, engage critically and conscientiously with a more accurate representation of the ancient Mediterranean past. And it's why it's also important to work with our colleagues in the sciences and social sciences to help excavate the history of scientific racism and recognize the roles that our academic disciplines and classical education in particular have played in it, because the race science of the 19th century has maintained its place in modern political and social discourses of nationalist and supremacist movements, and the classical is, of course, too often used and summoned up to support it. Our uses of the past in present contexts often rely upon an erasure or an amnesia of the realities of the past. We reshape the story to suit our present desires. And here I will give you two examples of that. This is the representation of the quote unquote Hindus. They spelled it with 2 O's. In the chapter of this volume called India, Land of Age and Mysticism, they were staged in front of a temple. But he says, among savage and barbarous peoples, such faith in magic, sorcerers, witches, and medicine men still continues to flourish. And it is therefore important for our understanding of the lower existent civilizations that our readers should not lose sight of the fact that similar illusions have prevailed among people recognized as representing the highest civilizations of their period. One of his emphases here is that he thinks the Hindus can progress to the next level. Not so the Pygmies in the chapter called Human Monstrosities of Fable and Fact. So this is a group of people. First, he refers to our macrocephaly, the acephaly in these groups here, but this is the part. Again, we find evidence of a connection between this legendary family and the real Dakos or Akos of Africa, who are supposed to be the pygmies of ancient fable to whom Herodotus so frequently refers. And this is an actual photograph. This is McGee again. And these are the quote unquote pygmies dancing. They don't look that small to me. But you make of them what you will. And then I'll leave this for you. This is a photograph from the volume of Patagonians and McGee's words on the backside of the photo. But my favorite part of it is that these people of whom the civilized world has read so much and seen so little are disappointing in at least one sense. For those of the exposition destroyed the general belief which prevailed to their great size. They were thought to be giants. And they disappointed the crowds, though they have satisfied the crowds in some other ways. So the ancient ideas discussed today may not have been racist in their original context, though some of them were, but they were and they continue to be used and deployed to support racist and supremacist structures that resonate throughout the world today. All right, thank you.